And the sermon's done. Nice Carl. Just as an aside, in response to what Carl said about why he gives, I recommend the work of Peter Rollins to you on that. Peter Rollins says that the most effective way for us to self-preserve, the most selfish thing we can do in the world around our own self-preservation is to care for others and to give to others. And he has a beautiful theological framework for that, which would take more than my allocated time to talk about. It would actually be a 4 or 5 weeks lecture series. So for anyone who's interested in that concept of giving to be selfish and to save yourself, giving as a self-interest, I recommend Peter's work. Who is my neighbor? We know the Good Samaritan story so well. In fact, culturally, the story of the Good Samaritan is so embedded into the world, we have a law called the Good Samaritan Law, right? If you are traveling along and you see a car accident and you leap from your vehicle to help, and you administer CPR or whatever, and you give whatever aid you can within your abilities, but are unable to, say, resuscitate or successfully protect the person, you are protected by law under the Good Samaritan Act, because you have acted out of an interest to care for others. We see people do stuff all the time. It is everywhere. We see people leap to the rescue of others in car accidents or in trouble, or just in a lot of ordinary everyday situations. The Good Samaritan story is so ingrained in our culture, it's really hard sometimes to hear the story with fresh ears. To hear it differently, to kind of try and come at it in a different way. We hear the story often as, do unto others as you have them do. So, we leap out of cars and care for people in accidents. Or we give food to the food bank, or we give money to charity. Those are all acts that kind of come out of the life of this story. But I want to look a little closer at this question, who is my neighbor? The question that the young lawyer asks Jesus, who is my neighbor? See, it's really easy to think about our neighbor in the terms of kind of those closest to us and those whom we hang out with and who look like us and walk like us and talk like us and, have the same educational level as us or same economic status as us. Those are pretty easy people to recognize as neighbors, right? We kind of see them and we're seen by them. One of the interests, I try and do a little research about the town I move to when I move in the church. Don't always do a lot, but I try and get a little done. And I was reading about, when I moved to Kelowna, one of the things I found, it's probably one of the strangest facts I've ever discovered about any town, ever, was that Kelowna has more gated communities than anywhere else in Canada. I know, more people live behind a gate in Kelowna than anywhere else. It is rife, obviously, with all kinds of terrible things happening at that. And a lot of those people went to my church. And I said this in a sermon one time. I thought I was going to get hung, drawn, and quartered. I said, why? Why do you live in a gated community in Kelowna? Like, this is not a ghetto of Detroit or Los Angeles. It's not Finch in Yonge in Toronto. Like, it's Kelowna. We like to feel safe. From what? They couldn't give me an answer. They had been told by the realtors or whoever had sold them the property that this or their families that this was the best option to be in a gated community. Best part of it was that whenever I went to visit anyone who lived in a gated community before 6 o'clock at night, guess what was open? The gates were always open. From about 7 o'clock in the morning to 6 o'clock at night, the gates were open. Anybody could have walked in.
Or they're broken.
Pardon?
Or they're broken.
No, they were all open. And so that was my question when I was asking the congregation. I said, why do you live in a gated community if you leave the gates open all the time? Like, what's the point? What are you so terrified of? Are you terrified of your neighbors? Like, who are the people and who are you frightened of? Who are you so terrified of that you live in a gated community in probably one of the safest cities in the country? Why do you live in a gated community? And they couldn't really answer the question for me. And so I started to think about, what is it? How do they understand who their neighbors were? Who were the people that they felt safe around? And that's the question here. When the young lawyer asked Jesus, so yeah, it's all fine and well, I gotta love my neighbor, but who is my neighbor? Who is the person I'm supposed to love? Well, we know love is easy. To love someone and to care, love being a verb, that it's easy to show actions of love to people, to live a life of love when people walk like us, talk like us, think like us. That's easy, right? That's really easy. It's so much harder when they look a little different. We experienced that when we brought the Syrian families in. There were people who were concerned that we were bringing terrorists into the country. Instead of people who were fleeing war. And we were criticized, publicly criticized. The folks who chose to sponsor refugee families were publicly criticized in the paper and other places for changing the face of our community. Because suddenly, if you've got something like, I think there's like 15 Syrian families now live in town. When you've got 15 families who all look very similar and kind of start hanging out together, you suddenly start realizing there's a community of them, and they do not look like us. They don't dress like us. They don't have the same color skin as a lot of us. They have different rituals and customs, because most of them are Muslims, not all of them, but most of them. They have different customs simply because they come from a different part of the universe than we are. But they're still our neighbors. They're still our neighbors. They live in our community. We work beside them. We grocery shop beside them. We're still our neighbors. They're still people we're called to serve. The realization that as I thought about this passage, one of the questions that I was wrestling with when I was thinking about this passage is, it's all fine and well when we talk about who we name as neighbor, but I wonder who calls you neighbor. We won't do a show of hands. I don't want to kind of put anyone on the spot. But I want you to think about a moment in your life. And we've all had it. Whether it's a boss, or a colleague, or a teacher, or someone in the street, there will be somebody in your life who has not seen you. Think about that. Think about a time when you realized you were not seen by someone. When they did not acknowledge that you were another human being living on this earth, who ate food, walked on the earth, went to work, functioned in the ordinary, everyday part of the world. There's actually a time when most of us have not been seen, where we've been looked over. And some of it's really subtle. Some of it's very, very subtle, not being seen. Sometimes we don't get seen because of our gender, or our gender identification, or our sexual orientation, Or we don't get seen because of our economic status. I remember when my dad went into long-term unemployment when the only significant employer in our town shut down. And how hard it was for him to be seen among we went from a town with pretty standard unemployment rates to a town with 80% unemployment in like a day, right? It was like, right? So 2 weeks before my dad's work came, and he went places, people saw him, right? And then he had to go for the first time, so when, they all had to go register for unemployment assistance. They'd all paid their taxes. They were all these men were entitled to it was mostly men. All these men were entitled to this money. There was nothing worse than going into that office and not being seen by the clerk at the desk. Now, I understand there were hundreds of men to be processed in a very short period. They had to process hundreds of people to get them onto unemployment assistance. But the clerk didn't look at them. The clerk didn't see human beings who were entitled to some respect. They were simply numbers and forms to be processed and to be gotten out of the way so the next one could be done. Not seeing someone as another human being is to not acknowledge them as neighbors, no matter where they come from or who they are. And it's such a simple thing. It's such a simple thing to simply acknowledge someone else's existence. My mom used to hate walking down Bernard Avenue with me in Kelowna because I would talk to all the street people. Because they all came to our church for assistance. So I knew all their names. My mom said to me, "Don't you know anyone normal?" Well, you can all discuss that later over coffee. But these were people who came every week to our church for food and coffee and some companionship. Was I going to only talk to them in that appropriate place of the church? Or am I going to say hello to them when I walk down the street? Are they only human when I have power over them? Because that's kind of what happens in the church. Like, I have all the power, right? I can say whether they can have food or not, right? Are they only human when I acknowledge that they're human because I have the power? Or are they human all the time? So when I walk down the street and I see them, I have to say hello because they're still my neighbors. They're still people I know. They're still the neighbor who requires and needs to be acknowledged as another human being. Our work in ministry as a community is about acknowledging our neighbors, all of our neighbors, and recognizing that the most selfish thing we can do is to be generous to others. Because as Carl said, we create a world we love when we do that. There's a couple of videos I want to show. The first is a social experiment. I'm going to, Dan, can you just hit the lights so the screen's a little bright? Thank you. This is a social experiment that's being done several times in several places by some young students. So if you can run the first one, that'd be great. Thanks. I'm going to give you a bit of a commentary because we can't really hear it or read it. So this young student is asking for food in a food court in a mall in America. And every time he asks somebody for food, now they're sitting with plates of food in front of them, they say no. These are on YouTube, by the way, folks, if you want to look at them closely.
Hey, excuse me, sir. Are you hungry? Because we actually just bought some food to give to someone, and we were wondering if you would like it. I mean, it's 2 burgers and fries and a drink. Would you like it? All right, yeah, of course, man. Yeah, of course. Have a good day, man.
This is the same young student who was asking
Is there
me
anybody
for
that has food? I'm really hungry. Thank you so much. Thank you. How long have you been out here? How long have you been out here? Yeah.
Excuse me, sir. Hey, I'm just paying it forward, and I'm actually just helping people that are in need, and I want to give you some like $10, so you can. Yeah, no problem, man. Have a great day.
I'm not from around here, man. No, where you from? I'm from Florida. Get out here. You don't happen to have you don't happen to have a dog I can have? Is there a dog? You get a dog. Thank you so much. God bless you.
You need $10.
Hey, thank you. Appreciate it.
Don't worry about it.
Thank you.
So the homeless guy passes the $10 on
Hey, Jenny, take care of it.
to the young man. This is a series of videos around the social experiment that these young men and women are doing, and they're going to different places and trying out a way of living, and they're offering, they find this response a lot among the homeless, that small amounts of food or money that they give will be automatically shared. That there's a sense of community that they actually engage in the homeless community, that they will share what they have in very generous ways, even with people they don't know. But being community is also about just how we act, and as Dan said in the introduction, it's a way of life. Now, I want to just say, I'm going to own this. Bikers are not my favorite people because some of them need their silencers fixed on their bikes. This is nothing personal against the individual bikers, but some of them are really loud. And I live near a busy intersection, and it can get loud on Sunday afternoons. Right? I'm just saying. I'm just going to own that. But bikers do actually have a bit of a reputation, right? They get a bad rap if you ride a bike, especially in a group. Well, you could be up to all kinds of bad stuff. This is another video I found. This is not a social experiment. This is just something that happens. Guys, you want to run the video? So these bikers are, there's no audio. So these bikers are going along the highway, and they notice this very elderly lady has not been able to complete crossing the highway while the lights are in her favor. Watch what they do. Watch all the cars whizzing past, and watch what these guys on their bikes do. These are people who normally, most of us would probably think, oh, bikers, right? Watch what they do. They form a guard around her to let her cross the road in safety. No car stops. No one else stops to help her. But people who we label, just as the Samaritan is labeled in this, is often labeled in the story that we have. You can turn off the ads. Thanks, guys. The Samaritan in his world is labeled as someone who is on the outside of the world, who is not pure, who is not. There's lots of labels Samaritans carry in Jesus' time. Just like bikers carry labels, like people like bikers often carry labels because, you know, they have really low backs. But people carry labels. Street people carry labels. And we are called to get past labels, to acknowledge that these people are our neighbors. And that the most selfish thing that you and I can do, the most selfish thing, the thing that will be best for us more than anything else, is to generously engage in the world.